"Get out of this pool right now, you dirty black man." That was the very first sentence my neighbor, the HOA president, chose to greet me with. Not a hello, not even a question. Just venom, thrown at me in the place I had worked years to build. And here's the part that made it worse. This wasn't their pool, not a community amenity, not some shared neighborhood perk. No, this was my backyard, on my property. A pool I paid to build with every permit and piece of paperwork in perfect order. But in Brenda Martinez's world, facts didn't matter. For 3 weeks straight, Brenda and her little circle of friends had treated my backyard like it was their private country club. They dragged in lawn chairs, coolers stacked with wine, and their endless, cackling laughter. They acted like I wasn't even there, as if my existence in this neighborhood was nothing but an inconvenience. Brenda had already run 12 families out with her power-hungry HOA antics, and now she wanted me gone too. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. She thought I'd roll over like the others. She thought I'd bow to her authority. What she didn't realize was that the man she underestimated the most was the man who was going to show her a lesson she'd never forget. The August sun was merciless that Tuesday evening. My shirt clung to my back by the time I pulled into my driveway after a long day of remote software work. I'd been dreaming of just one thing, grabbing a cold beer and maybe slipping into the pool, the one my mother and I had spent years saving to build. A pool that was supposed to be a symbol of everything we worked for. But that evening carried another weight too. 6 months had passed since I laid my mother, Rosa Washington, to rest. Every day without her voice in that house felt heavier. I could still hear her, clear as anything. "Jamal, baby, you home?" The words that used to greet me at the door. The silence since then had been deafening. That pool, that backyard, was supposed to be where I found a little peace. Instead, what I found made me freeze in place. 4 white women lounged around my pool, like it belonged to them. They'd set up beach chairs, blasted country music through a Bluetooth speaker, and scattered empty bottles like it was their second round of brunch cocktails. My patio furniture was covered in their mess, and sitting right in the middle, dressed like she was holding court, was Brenda Martinez. Sharp-featured, always overdressed, always dripping with that smug confidence that came from years of never being told no. I clenched my jaw, forced myself to remember the manners my mother drilled into me. "Excuse me, ladies," I said, keeping my voice even. "This is my private pool. I'm going to need you to pack up your things and leave." Finally, Brenda lifted her head, her eyes hidden behind designer sunglasses, but her tone was anything but hidden. "Sweetheart," she said, stretching the word out like poison. "This is the community pool. HOA regulations designate it for neighborhood use. You can check the rules if you want." The women around her broke into giggles like she'd just told the best joke in the world. My chest tightened. That old knot, the one I'd carried since childhood when teachers or shop clerks looked at me like trouble before I even opened my mouth. But along with the knot came something else, something I'd been carrying since the day I stood at my mother's hospital bed and promised I'd protect this house. The only thing she ever owned outright. "Ma'am," I said, steadying my voice, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I pulled out my phone, opening the folder where I kept every document, the property deed, the building permits, all of it. "This pool was built on my property with my money. It doesn't belong to the HOA. Brenda didn't even look. She waved my phone away with a flick of her wrist, took another sip of her drink, and smirked. "Oh, honey, you don't understand how things work. Mr. Henderson, the previous HOA president, moved away last month, so I stepped up. And part of my job is making sure community resources are properly used." Something about the way she said "moved away so suddenly" prickled the back of my neck, but there was no time to dwell. I noticed one of the women casually angling her phone, recording the whole exchange. My gut twisted. They'd done this before. I tried again. "I can show you the survey documents, the permits, anything you need to prove this pool is mine." That's when Brenda stood up, 5'6", but somehow towering over me, even though I stood a full 6 feet tall. "You know what your problem is?" she said loudly, her voice sharp enough for the whole block to hear. "You people move into nice neighborhoods like this and immediately cause problems. 12 families have already left because they couldn't follow our standards. And you're looking like the same kind of problem." Her words hit me like a punch. You people. Cold, rehearsed, deliberate. But what really stuck in my mind was that number, 12 families. How many had she forced out? How long had this been going on under the guise of standards? I drew in a slow breath. "I'm going to ask you one more time to leave my property. If you don't, I'll have to call the police." She laughed. Actually laughed. Then, with perfect calm, she pulled out her phone. "Oh, darling," she said, her voice dripping false sweetness. You don't need to call anyone. I'm ahead of you. She dialed, waited a moment, and then looked me dead in the eyes with a smile that turned my blood cold. Yes, police, she said. I need to report a threatening situation. There's an aggressive black man at 1247 Maple Street. He's harassing 4 women and making us feel unsafe. We're just trying to enjoy the community pool, and he's being hostile. Inappropriate. That last word, the way she emphasized it, it was a performance. Even her friends faltered for half a second, as if realizing how far she was pushing it. My stomach churned. My hands shook as I quickly opened my phone and hit record. If this was going to be twisted into her word against mine, I needed evidence. As she kept spinning lies into the phone, I thought of my mother again. Her last words at the hospital. Her hand weak in mine. This house is all you got left of me, baby. Promise me you'll protect it. Promise me you won't let nobody take what's ours. I had promised. And no matter what Brenda Martinez and her poolside posse tried, I intended to keep that promise. 15 minutes later, Detective Sarah Chen arrived. Compact, sharp-eyed, mid-30s, she scanned everything with quiet calculation as she stepped from her patrol car. Brenda and her crew were already in position, huddled together like a rehearsed scene out of a play. Phones clutched, whispers staged for effect. "Officer, thank God you're here," Brenda cried, tears springing up like magic. "This man has been terrorizing us. We were just enjoying our community pool time, like every week, and he came storming over, making threats, saying inappropriate things about what he wanted to do to us." Her voice cracked at just the right moment. I felt my stomach sink. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was theater, practiced and perfected. Detective Chen kept her face neutral, but I caught her eyes flicking to the obvious property lines. She asked Brenda, "Ma'am, can you be specific about these threats? What exactly did he say?" That's when the chorus began. One blonde woman said I'd been aggressive. Another claimed I made them feel unsafe. The third whispered that I looked at them predatorily. 4 women. 4 lies. Together, it was a coordinated character assassination. And they sounded so believable. 4 well-dressed suburban women against 1 black man. It was a story the world was too ready to accept. But then I felt the weight of the phone in my hand, the audio still recording. For the first time since this all began, a flicker of hope sparked inside me. "Detective Chen," I said, keeping my voice calm, respectful. "Before this goes any further, I think you should hear what happened here." I pulled out my phone and played back their recording. Starting from when I'd first asked them to leave my property, Brenda's voice came through crystal clear. 12 families have already had to relocate because they couldn't adapt to our community standards. The change in Detective Chen's expression was immediate and noticeable. She looked at Brenda with new interest, then back at me. "Mr. Washington, Jamal Washington. And this is my property. Detective, I can show you the deed. The building permits everything." Brenda's face had gone pale when she heard her own words played back, but she recovered quickly. "That recording is taken completely out of context," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You can't see his body language, his threatening posture. And I never said anything inappropriate about race. I was talking about community standards, which is my job as HOA president." Something about the way she said it made me pause. "Wait," I said. "What happened to Mr. Henderson? He was the HOA president when my mother and I moved here 2 years ago." Brenda waved her hand dismissively, but I noticed her friends exchanging glances. "Poor Mr. Henderson had to move away suddenly last month. Family emergency. Luckily, I was able to step up and take over their responsibilities. Someone has to maintain order around here." Detective Chen was now looking more interested in Brenda than in me, which seemed to make Brenda nervous. "I'm still using the Martinez name for official HOA business," Brenda added suddenly, unprompted. "My husband and I are separated, but the paperwork takes time to finalize. You know how it is." I filed that information away, wondering why she felt the need to explain her marital status to a police officer investigating an alleged threatening incident. "Ma'am," Detective Chen said to Brenda, "I'm going to need to see some documentation of your authority as HOA president. And Mr. Washington, I'll need to see your property documents as well." Brenda fumbled in her oversized purse and produced a folder with HOA letterhead, but I noticed Detective Chen examining it carefully. The documents looked official enough, but something about them seemed off. No official signatures, just a stamped seal that could have come from anywhere. As I showed Detective Chen my property deed, building permits, and the original HOA agreement that excluded private pools from community amenities, I watched Brenda's confidence begin to crack. She kept checking her phone and glancing toward the street like she was expecting backup that wasn't coming. "Look," she said finally, "I don't care what his paperwork says. We've been using this pool for weeks without any problems. Why is he suddenly making such a big deal about it now? The casual entitlement in her voice was staggering, but it was Detective Chen's response that surprised me. Ma'am, the issue isn't whether you've been using the pool. The issue is whether you have the legal right to use someone else's private property, regardless of any HOA regulations. Brenda's face flushed red. You can't just force us to leave. This is discrimination. Gender discrimination. He's targeting us because we're women. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at the irony of Brenda Martinez accusing me of discrimination. But Detective Chen wasn't amused. Ma'am, I'm going to need you and your friends to gather your belongings and leave Mr. Washington's property. If you have concerns about HOA regulations, you can address those through proper legal channels. As the four women reluctantly began packing up their things, Brenda turned to me with a look of pure venom. This isn't over, she said quietly, loud enough for me to hear, but not Detective Chen. I'm going to file formal complaints with the county, the HOA board, and anyone else who will listen. You have no idea what you've started. But as she walked away, I was already starting to wonder what I might find if I looked more closely at those HOA documents she'd shown Detective Chen, especially considering how quickly Mr. Henderson had apparently disappeared from the picture. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Brenda's voice saying 12 families and community standards with that cold, calculated tone. So, at 2:00 a.m., I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and every piece of HOA documentation I could find, including the original papers Mom and I had signed when we moved in. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Our neighborhood HOA agreement clearly stated that private pools like mine were explicitly excluded from community amenities. The only shared facilities were the small playground at the front of the development and the mailbox cluster areas. Yet somehow, Brenda had been operating under completely different rules, and I was starting to suspect she'd been making them up as she went along. Around 3:00 a.m., I found something that made my blood run cold. Buried in my email archives was a message from Mr. Henderson, the former HOA president, sent just 6 weeks ago. Dear residents, it read after careful consideration and consultation with my family. I am resigning from my position as HOA president, effective immediately. Recent threats of legal action have made it impossible for me to continue serving this community in good faith. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. Threats of legal action from whom? I kept digging and found 3 more emails from other former board members, all citing similar reasons for stepping down around the same time. It was like there had been a coordinated purge of the entire HOA leadership, leaving only Brenda in charge by default. The next morning, I decided to do some detective work of my own. I started by Googling the 12 families Brenda had mentioned, cross-referencing the neighborhood directory with recent property sales. What I found made my stomach turn. The Gonzalez family, the Patels, the Johnsons who were mixed race, the elderly Korean couple, the single mother with 2 kids, and 7 other families. All people of color or those who didn't fit Brenda's apparent vision of suburban perfection. All had sold their houses in the past 18 months, most at below market value, suggesting they were desperate to get out quickly. I was printing out property records when my phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. Somehow I'd been added to a group called Preserve Maple Street Safety with over 200 members. The group was a masterclass in coded racism and digital manipulation. Brenda had posted a carefully edited video of our confrontation yesterday, but it only showed me approaching 4 women by a pool and asking them to leave. She'd edited out all context, all audio of her calling it a community pool, and all traces of her "you people" comment. The caption read, "This is the kind of aggressive behavior that's been escalating in our neighborhood." 4 women were just trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon when this man approached them in a threatening manner. How are we supposed to feel safe when newcomers refuse to respect established community traditions? The comments below were a toxic mixture of dog whistle, racism, and fake concern about property values. But what got to me was the photos. Brenda had somehow obtained pictures of several of the families who'd left the neighborhood and posted them in a thread about concerning behavioral patterns. There was the Gonzalez family's teenage son, labeled as loitering suspiciously near mailboxes. The Patel family's cultural decorations during Diwali were described as non-conforming, displays that affect neighborhood aesthetics. Mrs. Johnson's basketball hoop was cited as creating noise disturbances and attracting undesirable elements. Every single post was designed to sound reasonable on the surface, while painting these families as problems that needed to be solved. I was taking screenshots of everything when my doorbell rang. Standing on my front porch was a man I didn't recognize, holding a small girl's hand. He was black, probably in his 40s, with the kind of bearing that suggested a military background. "You must be Jamal," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Marcus Thompson. I live 2 streets over, and this is my granddaughter, Emma. We heard about what happened yesterday. Emma, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, looked up at me with wide, serious eyes. "Are you okay, Mr. Jamal?" she asked. "My grandpa says the mean lady was being very rude to you." I invited them in, and Marcus explained that he'd been watching Brenda's reign of terror for months, but hadn't known how to fight back effectively. "She got the Washingtons on Elm Street," Marcus told me, and my heart sank as I realized he was talking about a different Washington family, no relation to me. Accused their teenage daughter of inappropriate sunbathing attire in their backyard, filed noise complaints about their family barbecues, even tried to get the city to cite them for having too many cars in their driveway when relatives visited for graduations. He pulled out his phone and showed me a voice memo. "I've been recording the HOA meetings ever since she took over. Want to hear something interesting?" The audio was scratchy, but I could hear Brenda's voice saying, "We need to maintain the character of this neighborhood. Some of these newer residents don't understand the standards we've worked so hard to establish here." That evening, I had what I can only describe as a dream about my mother, though it felt more real than any dream I'd ever had. She was sitting in her favorite kitchen chair, the one she'd brought from our old apartment when we first moved to this house. "Baby," she said, her voice as clear as if she were there. "You remember what I taught you about bullies when you were little?" Nodded. "Even in the dream, don't you dare let that woman scare you away from what's yours. You stand up and you fight back, but you do it smart. You hear me?" When I woke up, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day she died. Determination. Brenda Martinez had picked the wrong family to mess with, and she had no idea what she'd awakened. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in her perfectly manicured living room, Brenda Martinez sat alone on her white leather sofa, clutching a faded ultrasound photo from 3 years ago. The baby she'd lost at 22 weeks would have been walking now, maybe even talking. The divorce papers from Daniel were scattered on her coffee table. Another reminder of everything she couldn't control. But the neighborhood, this perfect little slice of suburban order, was something she could control. That was something she could keep, exactly the way it was supposed to be. She carefully placed the ultrasound back in its frame and opened her laptop to plan her next move against the man who dared to challenge her authority. The next morning, Marcus called me with information that would change everything. "Jamal, you need to meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street in an hour," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "And bring everything you've found about Brenda's HOA activities. Trust me on this one." When I arrived at the small cafe, Marcus was already there with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse and a grim expression that told me I wasn't going to like what I was about to hear. "I did some digging after our conversation yesterday," he began, sliding the folder across the table. "Turns out our self-appointed neighborhood dictator has quite the history." The first document in the folder was a State Bar Association disciplinary record. Brenda Martinez, formerly Brenda Collins, had been suspended from practicing law 3 years ago for systematic manipulation of real estate contracts and engaging in discriminatory practices that violated fair housing regulations. The details were damning. She'd been caught systematically steering minority clients away from certain neighborhoods while helping white clients break lease agreements in diversifying areas. She lost her law license, her reputation, and her marriage all in the same year, Marcus explained. According to the public records, her husband, Daniel, filed for divorce, citing her obsessive need to control every aspect of their environment as irreconcilable differences. But the real bombshell was what Marcus had discovered about her current HOA position. "She's not legally the president of anything," he said, pulling out a series of emails he'd somehow obtained after she forced Henderson to resign with threats off frivolous lawsuits. "She simply declared herself the new president. There was never an election, never a proper vote, nothing. She's been running this neighborhood like her personal thief, based on absolutely no legitimate authority." The email chain showed a pattern of harassment that was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Henderson had been targeted with complaints about his failure to maintain community standards after he defended a Muslim family's right to have a small decorative fountain in their front yard. I was still processing this information when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Mr. Washington, this is Tommy Rodriguez. I installed your security cameras last month, remember?" I did remember Tommy, a quiet guy in his 30s who ran a small home security business. "I think we need to talk," he continued. "I've been installing systems all over your neighborhood for the past year, and I've seen some things that might interest you. Can you meet me at my shop this afternoon?" Something in his tone told me this wasn't a sales call. Tommy's shop was a cramped space filled with monitors, camera equipment, and the kind of technical gear that suggested he took his work seriously. "Look, I normally don't get involved in neighborhood drama," he said, pulling up a chair. "But what Brenda Martinez has been doing to people around here, It's not right. He showed me a laptop displaying what appeared to be security footage from multiple angles around the neighborhood. She doesn't know that half the cameras I install for security purposes are documenting her activities. Watch this. The footage showed Brenda systematically going through the Patel family's trash, photographing anything she could use as evidence of non-compliance. Another clip showed her placing what looked like fast food wrappers in the Johnson family's front yard, then photographing them as evidence of littering. She's been manufacturing violations, Tommy explained, his voice filled with disgust, planting evidence, taking photos out of context, even timing her complaints to coincide with cultural celebrations so she could claim the families were being disruptive. The worst part is she documented everything herself, kept detailed files on every family she targeted, including notes about the best strategies to make them want to leave. He handed me a flash drive. This contains security footage from 12 different houses over the past 18 months. It's enough to prove fraud, harassment, and probably half a dozen civil rights violations. As we talked, my phone started buzzing with notifications. Brenda had escalated her social media campaign, and now local news outlets were picking up the story. HOA conflict turns racial in suburban neighborhood. Read the headline from Channel 7's website. The article was based on Brenda's version of events, painting me as a newcomer who refuses to respect long-established community guidelines, and suggesting that racial tensions are rising in what was once a peaceful family neighborhood. The comments section was predictably toxic, filled with people who'd never set foot in our neighborhood, but had plenty of opinions about property values and community standards. But then something unexpected happened. My phone rang, and a nervous voice on the other end said, "Mr. Washington, this is Daniel Martinez. I think we need to talk." Brenda's arranged husband sounded exhausted and defeated. "I've been watching the news coverage of what's happening in your neighborhood, and I can't stay silent anymore. Brenda is sick, Mr. Washington. What she's doing to you and those other families, it's the same pattern of behavior that destroyed our marriage. The need to control everything. The inability to see other people as human beings who deserve respect. The way she turns every disagreement into a war that has to be won at any cost." He paused, and I could hear him taking a shaky breath. "I have documents, email chains, recorded phone calls where she talks about her strategies for dealing with undesirable neighbors. She kept everything like she was proud of it." That evening, as I sat in my backyard looking at the pool that had started this whole mess, I realized Brenda had made a crucial mistake. She'd been so focused on controlling the narrative and manipulating the community that she'd left a paper trail a mile long. Every family she'd harassed, every violation she'd manufactured, every abuse of power she'd committed, it was all documented. She'd been so confident in her authority that she'd never considered the possibility that someone might actually fight back with evidence instead of just moving away quietly. Tomorrow, I was going to call for an emergency HOA meeting, and Brenda Martinez was going to find out exactly what happened when someone finally stood up to her reign of terror. What she didn't know was that I already had everything I needed to expose. Her and the neighborhood was about to learn the truth about their so-called president. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, and word had spread fast. By 700 p.m., nearly 50 residents had packed into the small meeting room, more than had attended any neighborhood gathering in years. Brenda sat at the front table like a queen holding court, surrounded by her usual supporters and looking smugly confident that she was about to deliver the final blow to my reputation. She'd spent the last 3 days doubling down on her social media campaign, painting herself as a victim of racial harassment and me as a dangerous outsider, threatening the safety of innocent women. What she didn't know was that I'd spent those same 3 days carefully coordinating with Marcus, Tommy, and even Daniel to ensure that tonight's meeting would be one she'd never forget. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brenda began, standing up with a folder of what I assumed were more manufactured complaints. "We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community safety and values. Over the past week, I've been personally attacked, threatened, and subjected to harassment simply for trying to uphold the standards that make our neighborhood a desirable place to live." She gestured dramatically toward me, sitting calmly in the third row with Marcus beside me. "This individual has shown a pattern of aggressive behavior, refuses to respect community guidelines, and has made it clear that he has no intention of integrating peacefully into our established way of life." The murmurs from her supporters suggested they were buying every word of her performance. But then I stood up, pulling out my phone and connecting it to the portable speaker I'd brought specifically for this moment. "Mrs. Martinez, before you continue, I think everyone here should hear what happened that day at my pool." I played the audio recording from our first confrontation, and Brenda's voice filled the room crystal clear. "You people move into nice neighborhoods like this and immediately start causing problems. 12 families have already had to relocate because they couldn't adapt to our community standards." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop as those words hung in the air. And I watched Brenda's face go pale as she realized her carefully crafted narrative was about to crumble. "That recording is taken out of context," Brenda said quickly, but her voice was shaking now. "You can't judge an entire situation based on a few seconds of audio." That's when Marcus stood up and addressed the room. "We can judge it based on 18 months of documented evidence." He nodded to Tommy, who had set up a laptop connected to a projector screen. The first video showed Brenda rifling through the Gonzalez family's garbage, photographing anything she could use against them. The second showed her placing fast food wrappers in the Johnson family's yard, then taking pictures as evidence of littering. The gasps and angry murmurs from the audience told me that people were finally seeing Brenda's true nature. But the moment that broke her was when little Emma's parents stood up to speak. "Our 8-year-old daughter came home from playing outside last month in tears," Emma's mother said, her voice shaking with emotion. "She said the HOA lady told her that little black girls shouldn't be so loud when they play because it disturbs the civilized people. Emma asked me what civilized people meant and why she wasn't one of the blackpaths.com them." The room erupted in angry voices, and I saw several white families looking genuinely horrified. This wasn't about property values or community standards anymore. This was about a grown woman traumatizing children with racist rhetoric. That's when Brenda completely lost control. "I never said that," she screamed, standing up so fast her chair fell backward. "These people are making things up to destroy me. All I've ever done is try to protect this neighborhood from becoming another crime-ridden ghetto." The room went dead silent again. But this time, it was the silence of shock rather than attention. Brenda had just said the quiet part out loud, and there was no taking it back. "I've sacrificed everything for this community," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "My career, my marriage, my sanity, and for what? So that people like him can move in and turn our safe, clean neighborhood into something unrecognizable." Just as she was reaching peak meltdown mode, the community center door opened, and in walked a man I recognized from photos as Daniel Martinez. He was carrying a briefcase and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "but I have some court documents that need to be served." Brenda's face went from red to white in about 2 seconds flat. "Daniel, what are you doing here? You can't just show up at my official HOA business." But Daniel was already pulling papers from his briefcase. "Brenda, that's exactly why I'm here. These are restraining order documents that specifically prohibit you from using the Martinez name in any official capacity. You're also being served with papers for fraud and misrepresentation, since you've been acting as HOA president without any legal authority to do so." The room was in complete chaos. Now Brenda was screaming about betrayal and conspiracy. Daniel was trying to explain to Detective Chen, who had apparently been called by someone in the crowd, that his ex-wife had been impersonating a legitimate HOA official for months. Marcus was calmly reading from a list of civil rights violations that could be filed against Brenda, and Tommy was showing more security footage of her manufactured evidence campaigns. In the middle of all this, a formal vote was called by Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Henderson's wife, who had driven over as soon as she heard about the meeting. The vote to remove Brenda from any HOA authority was 43-3, with even her closest supporters abandoning ship once they realized the legal liability they might face for supporting her activities. As the crowd began to disperse and Brenda sat slumped in her chair, looking smaller and more broken than I'd ever seen her, I thought the nightmare was finally over. The truth was out. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood could start healing from the damage she'd caused. But as I was packing up my equipment and saying goodbye to Marcus and the other families who had supported me tonight, I had no idea that Brenda Martinez's complete psychological breakdown was just beginning, and that her final act of desperation would force me to call the police one more time. 3 days after the disastrous HOA meeting, I thought Brenda Martinez had finally accepted defeat and would quietly fade into whatever comes after a complete public humiliation. I was wrong, dead wrong. At 3:17 a.m. on Sunday, my phone started buzzing with security alerts from the new camera system Tommy had upgraded for me after all the neighborhood drama. The live feed showed a figure in dark clothing moving around my backyard, and it took me a few seconds to realize it was Brenda, carrying what looked like several large containers toward my pool. She was moving with the kind of determined purpose that immediately set off every alarm bell in my head. I grabbed my phone and started recording as I watched her through the app, not quite believing what I was seeing. Brenda was systematically pouring what appeared to be bleach and some kind of industrial cleaning acid into my pool, muttering to herself the entire time. The audio pickup was good enough that I could hear fragments of her rambling. "If I can't use it, nobody can use it. Think you're so smart. Show you what happens when you mess with me." She was having a complete psychological break, and she was doing it in my backyard while attempting to destroy the very thing that had started our conflict. I immediately called 911, but I also called Marcus, knowing I'd need witnesses for whatever was about to happen by the time Detective Chen arrived with backup. Brenda had moved on to throwing patio furniture into the pool and was attempting to smash the underwater lighting system with a garden shovel she'd brought from home. The chemical smell was overwhelming, and I realized she dumped enough bleach and acid into the water to create a genuinely dangerous situation. "Ma'am, step away from the pool and put down the shovel," Detective Chen called out, but Brenda spun around like a cornered animal. "You don't understand!" she screamed, waving the shovel in the air. He destroyed everything. My reputation, my authority, my entire life. This pool represents everything that's wrong with what this neighborhood has become. Marcus arrived just as 3 more patrol cars pulled up, and I watched from my back door as what had started as a property dispute turned into a full-scale mental health crisis. Brenda was now standing knee-deep in the chemically contaminated water, still holding the shovel and ranting about how she'd dedicated her life to maintaining standards and how people like him had ruined everything she'd worked to build. "I was trying to preserve something beautiful," she sobbed, her voice echoing across the quiet neighborhood as lights came on in houses all around us. "I lost my baby. I lost my husband. I lost my career. And the only thing I had left was keeping this place the way it was supposed to be." Detective Chen was trying to talk her down, but Brenda was beyond reasoning at this point. "You want to know the truth?" she yelled, looking directly at me. "That baby I lost 3 years ago, we were going to name him Marcus Daniel Martinez. And when he died, Daniel blamed me, said my stress levels were too high, that I was too obsessed with controlling everything around me." She was crying openly now, the shovel hanging limply in her hand. "But I wasn't trying to control everything. I was just trying to make sure nothing else would change. Nothing else would be taken away from me. And then he moved in." She pointed at me with the shovel, and everything started changing again. The tragedy of it hit me like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had channeled her grief and trauma into a toxic need to control her environment. And when that control was threatened, she'd lashed out with the only weapons she had: manipulation, racism, and abuse of whatever authority she could claim. But understanding her pain didn't excuse the damage she'd caused to 12 families, the trauma she'd inflicted on children like Emma, or the systematic harassment she'd directed at anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of community standards. "Mrs. Martinez," I called out, stepping onto my back patio despite Detective Chen's gesture for me to stay back. "I'm sorry for your loss. I am. But what you did to those families, what you tried to do to me, that wasn't protecting anything. That was hurting innocent people." That's when she completely snapped. "Innocent?" she shrieked, raising the shovel above her head. "You people destroyed my neighborhood. You brought crime and noise and changed the whole character of this place." There it was again. That phrase, "you people." But this time, there was no mistaking the raw hatred behind it. She charged toward me with the shovel, but slipped on the wet pool deck and went down hard, the shovel clattering across the concrete. Detective Chen and the other officers immediately moved in to restrain her. But she was still screaming about how I'd ruined everything and how she was going to make sure I paid for what I'd done to her community. As the paramedics checked Brenda for injuries, and the officers prepared to arrest her on charges that would now include breaking, destruction of property, assault with a weapon, and chemical endangerment, I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected: pity. This woman had let her grief and fear transform her into someone who could terrorize children and drive families from their homes. But at her core, she was just a broken person who had never learned how to process loss without trying to control everything around her. The irony wasn't lost on me that in her desperate attempt to preserve what she saw as the right kind of neighborhood, she had become the very thing that made it unsafe and unwelcoming for everyone. The charges against Brenda would be serious. Multiple felonies, including hate crimes, harassment, fraud, and now assault, and destruction of property. But as I watched them load her into the back of the patrol car, still ranting about community standards and property values, I knew that this was just the beginning of a much longer conversation our neighborhood and our country needed to have about grief, control, racism, and what it means to build a community where everyone belongs. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in a downtown courthouse, waiting to hear Brenda Martinez's sentencing. The intervening weeks had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and neighborhood healing that I could never have imagined when this whole thing started with 4 women refusing to leave my pool. The charges against Brenda were extensive: multiple felonies, including hate crimes, harassment, fraud, assault with a weapon, destruction of property, and chemical endangerment. The prosecutor was pushing for the maximum: sentence of 18 months in prison plus 5 years of supervised. probation, along with $50, $1,000, in restitution to cover the damage to my pool and legal fees for the families she'd harassed. But as I sat there watching Brenda's court-appointed attorney present her case, I heard something that genuinely surprised me. Her lawyer revealed that during her 3 months in jail awaiting trial, Brenda had been diagnosed with severe clinical depression and PTSD stemming from her miscarriage and subsequent divorce. Court-ordered psychological evaluations showed that she had channeled her grief into an obsessive need to control her environment. And when that control was threatened, she'd lashed out with increasingly desperate and harmful behavior. Your Honor, her attorney said, my client doesn't need just punishment. She needs treatment. She needs help processing the trauma that turned her into someone she never intended to become. When it came time for victim impact statements, I listened as representatives from 8 of the 12 families Brenda had driven away spoke about the damage she'd caused. Mrs. Patel talked about her teenage daughter's anxiety attacks every time they saw a police car. Convinced that Brenda had called in another false complaint, Miss Johnson described having to explain to his young son why the nice lady from the HOA had told him that black boys who played basketball were creating disturbances for decent families. Emma's parents spoke about months of therapy to help their daughter understand that there was nothing wrong with being a loud black girl who enjoyed playing outside. Then it was my turn to speak, and I found myself standing up in that courtroom with words I hadn't planned. Your Honor, what Brenda Martinez did to me and those families was wrong. It was harmful. It was racist. And it caused real damage to real people, including children who will carry those scars for years. I looked over at Brenda, who was sitting with her head down, tears streaming down her face. But I also believe that people can change, and that healing requires more than just punishment. If Mrs. Martinez is willing to do the real work of understanding why she caused so much harm, if she's willing to make real amends to the families she hurt, then he would support a reduced sentence that includes mandatory therapy and community service. Judge Patricia Williams looked genuinely moved by the proceeding. Mr. Washington, your compassion in the face of such treatment is remarkable, she said. And Mrs. Martinez, you are extraordinarily fortunate to have someone willing to show you mercy when you showed none to others. She sentenced Brenda to 12 months in prison, 3 years of supervised probation, mandatory psychological counseling, 500 hours of community service focused on fair housing education, and full restitution to all affected families. But more importantly, she required Brenda to write personal apology letters to each family she had harmed, and to attend diversity and sensitivity training programs. The media attention from our case had been intense, and I found myself doing interviews with local news stations about standing up to racism and the importance of community solidarity. The message I want people to take from this, I told Channel 7's evening anchor, is that healing is a longer road than revenge, but it's the only path to real change. We can't fight hatred with more hatred. We have to fight it with truth, with evidence, and ultimately with the kind of compassion that creates space for people to become better than they were. The interview clip went viral on social media, and I started receiving messages from people in similar situations across the country. 6 months after Brenda's sentencing, something incredible happened in our neighborhood. 8 of the 12 families she had driven away decided to move back. The Gonzalez family bought their old house back from the people who had purchased it. The Patels found a larger home 2 streets over. The Johnsons returned to the same address they'd been forced to leave. Our newly reformed HOA, now led by Marcus Thompson as president and me as vice president, had established a diversity and inclusion committee that made sure something like Brenda's reign of terror could never happen again. We implemented transparent voting procedures, regular community forums, and clear guidelines for addressing complaints that prevented any one person from accumulating unchecked power. But the most meaningful change happened in my backyard. I had renovated the pool that Brenda had tried to destroy, and instead of keeping it private, I opened it to the entire neighborhood as a community space. I installed a memorial plaque that read Rosa Washington Community Pool in memory of a mother who taught her son that home is worth fighting for. Every Saturday during the summer, we held what we called Unity Pool Parties, where families from every background brought food to share, and kids played together in the water that had once been a symbol of division. The day that drove home how much things had changed was when little Emma ran up to me during one of our pool parties, her hair dripping wet and her eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Jamal, are you a superhero?" she asked with the kind of innocent directness that only 8-year-olds can manage. "My grandpa says you saved our neighborhood from the mean lady." I laughed and knelt to her level, pretending to check the pool temperature with exaggerated seriousness. "Well, Emma, the water temperature is exactly 78 degree F, which is perfect for both superheroes and regular kids who just want to have fun." She giggled and ran back to join the other children, and I watched kids of every color playing together in the space that had once been ground zero for so much hatred and fear. Today, when I look out at that pool and see those children laughing and playing together, when I see their parents sharing stories and recipes and building the kind of community my mother always dreamed of, I know she would be proud. Maybe that's what she meant when she told me to protect this house. She wasn't just talking about protecting the building or the property. She was talking about protecting the idea of home as a place where everyone belongs, where children can grow up without carrying the hatred of previous generations, where differences are celebrated rather than feared. This house, this neighborhood, this community we've built together. It's not perfect, but it's proof that when people stand up for what's right, when they choose healing over hatred, real change is possible. Racism doesn't always come with burning crosses or shouted slurs. Sometimes it wears a smile and hides behind community standards and property values. Jamal's story shows us that when we document the truth, stand together as neighbors, and refuse to be silently pushed out, we can expose hatred for what it is. Real change happens when good people stop staying quiet and start speaking up even when it's uncomfortable. Have you ever witnessed subtle racism in your community? Or seen someone find the courage to call it out? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in these conversations. If this story opened your eyes or strengthened your resolve, please like and subscribe to Chanel. When we share these real experiences, we help others recognize injustice and find the strength to fight